Hi, everybody. I'm Jackson McIntosh. I am a Vice President at American Express, and I'm really, really pleased to be here today with Ruchika Lal, who has been in the corporate sector in the United States for the last 15 years at Ogilvy and Mather, UBS, and where we knew each other actually at American Express, where she was actually my boss for a number of years. So really, really pleased to be able to finally ask some tough questions here where she's not writing my performance reviews. Ruchika, really pleased to be here with you.
And thank you, Jackson, for doing this. And now this is payback time, so you can ask me the tough questions.
Yeah, here we go. It's going to be exciting. So, Ruchika, I know you guys have chosen the topic, women in power in the workplace, own your power. Mm-hmm. And I'd love to just start with the question, why did you choose that topic and not many of the others you could have chosen?
That's a great question. I actually thought a lot about what the topic can be, and there's so much that we can do about women in the workplace. And after so many years of mentoring women, coaching women, I realized that power kept coming up again and again. And it comes up in the workplace in very interesting ways. And I have been at the receiving end of it, right? You get feedback like, you don't have executive presence. You don't have gravitas. And it's very difficult to decode what those words mean at the workplace, right? Because, okay, you could dress up a certain way, you could wear high heels, you could be a little aggressive, but none of that really seems to work. So for me, the journey has been a little bit understanding and decoding and unpacking what power really means. And one of the things that I realized, and I would get the feedback always, like within work, even outside of work, you're playing less than you are. You're not owning your full potential. And I'm like, what does that even mean? Until I realized that a lot of times women, me included, did not have a very healthy role model of power. Power meant that somebody who was really larger than life, charismatic, and they induced maybe a little bit of fear in you, and maybe a little bit made you shrink. And somebody really powerful is like they're expanded and you're shrunk. And when you feel powerful, you're expanded and somebody else is shrunk. And that doesn't seem like a very healthy concept of power. So for me, the journey has been actually digging down and saying, okay, what does power really mean? What is a good role model of power in my life? How can I have my power, own it completely, without undermining anybody else's? And I think that's the journey for a lot of people, especially women in the workplace.
How do you feel that those expectations kind of realize themselves with women specifically as opposed to men?
It's a great question. So some things, and research, so much research has been done about women in the workplace. Things that I have noticed in so many years is, if there is a table full of people and there's, not enough chairs around the table, you will see that more often than not, it will be the woman who will take the seat not at the table. Another example, like women might be in a meeting, but when they have points of view, they feel the need to over-explain, to kind of talk about why they should be at the table, not realizing they already have a seat at the table. So this thing of wanting to explain, to prove that they have earned a seat at the table tends to be far more with women than with men. I mean, and we work together a lot of times, and we've had these conversations. Men would come up to me in coaching conversations and talk about how ready they were to be the CEO of the company. Forget Steve Jobs and forget anybody else. They were ready to take on that kind of role. Whereas for women, I've had to literally egg them on, let them know that they were ready for the next role. They'll talk about, I don't have this qualification, I have never done this before. And that doesn't tend to undermine men. Even if they've never done that role, they feel very confident about taking that position up.
I mean, how do you feel that, I think on that topic, maybe the expectations that either women put on themselves or that the workplace puts on women around talent versus experience? How does that play itself out in terms of, I think, women thinking about their readiness for roles?
I think it's a really good question again. I think it's the narratives. People always have narratives about you. And I think the big one are the narratives we start internalizing. And I think women tend to internalize the narratives a little bit more than men. So even as a kid, if somebody said you're not smart enough, your entire life, every interaction you're trying to prove to people that you are smart. Or somebody said you were not beautiful enough. And literally every interaction is showing up a little bit less than you are. And I think for all of us, these are broad generalizations, how do you kind of look at the narratives that somebody said at some time that have now become your belief system? Because those belief systems show up, and they show up in not the healthiest manners, right? They show up in passive aggressiveness. They show up in you showing up less than you are. It can also show up in kind of, being very aggressive and undermining other people, none of which are healthy.
So I'm curious to hear what you think about the way conflict maybe gets expressed in this dynamic of power, and specifically like how conflict gets brought up by women versus men, how it gets resolved by women versus men, and then maybe how it sort of creates kind of a hangover afterwards once it's been resolved. Like my experience in some cases is that men tend to, I think, almost embrace conflict, go at it really fast and hard, and then forget about it.
Mm-hmm.
And I sometimes see a different dynamic with women. I'd love to hear your perspective.
I think you're quite on the money. Again, these are broad generalizations. I think men are more comfortable with conflict, and in my opinion, have been okay being aggressive and assertive, right? The alpha male. Women tend to be a little bit more peace-giving. I mean, conflict is something that people tend to be averse to, and when that happens, I think you kind of either back up a little bit. You don't like it because you don't want to back off, so it comes up many interactions later in a one-off comment that will make people wonder where the hell did that come from, or it might be in a more emotional manner, which again people might not know how to deal with. So it does show up in ways again which will confuse people. So I think the thing is, anything that you're craving for or averse to, if you are averse to conflict, neither do you like it and nor do people around you like it. And so women, I have seen, a lot of them, what can happen is they will keep it to themselves, but there will be a lot of conversation after the meeting, right? There'll be a lot of water cooler conversations, and that doesn't really help again.
Do you think these things are changing, these expectations? There's been so much commentary in the media, the lean-in movement. I think a lot of focus on this dynamic in the workplace, but, the glass ceiling has not been shattered yet, so I'd love to hear your perspective on, maybe when you entered the workforce 15 years ago versus what we're seeing now.
I think the dynamic will take a little bit longer. I think, I was just reading about this and research again, the equal number of men and women entering the workforce. But if you look at the number of CEOs are at very senior levels, you're talking single digits, right? So somewhere along the line, this dynamic shows up. I think there's far more awareness about how women leaders show up. And they may not be the way male leaders show up. And we have an archetype as to what a leader looks like, which is normally a male leader. So there hasn't been as much allowance for a different kind of role model to show up. And I think, this generation potentially will see a lot more of that. Small things like, again, research. When men communicate, it's far more linear. It's far more structured. Less is more. Whereas women tend to be lateral thinkers. So there is a little bit more of, opening up a lot of loose ends and then connecting it. But men find it difficult to follow. So, the feedback that normally a woman will get is, you need to get a little bit more structured. Talk at the right level. Don't over-explain. So all of this, not realizing some of it might also be gender-driven.
So do you think that sometimes, obviously we're talking in very broad generalizations, and people are very unique and they will conform to all these stereotypes, but what would you say about maybe women that feel like they have to conform to a certain kind of a standard, right? Like linear thinking and linear explanation. If they feel like that's not what comes natural to them, how do you find that balance between what works for you and where your own kind of power resides versus what's expected of you maybe in terms of just norms of the workplace?
Yeah, I think a lot of it will go back to confidence. I'll give you an example. So I came to this country many, many years back, and I was in B school, and I had curly hair, which I do, and a nose pin, right? And my previous experience was Ogilvy, which is advertising. And I remember friends of mine and even family taking me aside who had been around here for a little bit and said, Ruchika, if you really want to get a job, you might want to straighten your hair and you might want to get rid of your nose pin because people will think of you as a hippie, and curly hair, Ogilvy, nose pin all coming together is gives a certain kind of perception, and the professional look is a straight hair look. At that time I could have bought that story, and I did think about it because these are people who really care about me. They wanted me to succeed. But then the question to myself is, how much of this is a slippery slope? How much of myself am I going to change? Not because I want to change, but because the workplace wants me to be a certain way. And will I become a person that I can't even recognize a few years or a decade down the line? And I remember having this very serious conversation with myself and saying, you know what, it's okay for me not to get a job, but I need to be true to myself. And if a workplace likes me, they need to like me for who I am and the thought process and the other abilities that I'm bringing rather than the way I look. But that takes a little bit of courage. and also a lot of confidence, right? And sometimes there are consequences to it, and you've got to be okay with it, because as long as there might be some jobs that I may not have gotten because of all of these reasons, but I've got to be comfortable with it because something else is far more important.
I mean, what it sounds like you're talking about is sort of like an expression of power, kind of
Yeah.
where we started the conversation, right? I mean, how do you think about those choices, right? If you're having to make a compromise between what you think is sort of like your natural source of authority and power versus what's being expected of you, if you feel like it's bending kind of that authenticity, how do you think about just like navigating those? Because you're always going to be asked to make compromises.
Yeah.
Right?
And I think some of them are fine if you're comfortable with it. I mean, there are some things that you're down the sword for and others that you don't. And you've got to figure out how much is the allowance over there. I think compromises are okay, but if they make you do something that makes you feel less than, if it makes you feel like a different person, then you will always have a little bit of the imposter syndrome. You'll always feel like you will be found out. And that I don't think is powerful, because you will show up a little bit smaller than you are. And the question is, how do you show up with your, like a peacock full feathers out without undermining anybody else's feathers, right? And that can only happen when you're completely comfortable in your own skin, right? You go into a room and it does not really matter what people think of you. Not in a rude or abrasive manner, but you're okay with who you are, with all your imperfections, with all the talents that you have. Owning it 100% is what gives you that power. And then even conflict is completely fine, because you and me can disagree. You might hate me for it for those few minutes, but I'm okay with that because I've spoken my truth and I've allowed you to speak your truth.
Would you say that this is something that companies have an obligation to try and foster, right? How do you create a culture that allows people to, I think, express these sorts of differences in a healthy way, but also have a balance so that you're not unconsciously biased towards one side versus the other? Obviously the men's side. That's the side that-
No, but I think it's really important for women to be able to hold their own or own their power, even people at more junior level, even men. I think it's the responsibility of senior leaders to be able to create that space, for people to be themselves, right? And I think in some ways, because of the Industrial Revolution, we still have a little bit of a hang-up where everybody shows up the same way. I mean, we talk about diversity of thought, but to a very large extent, that's lip service.
Yeah, I would agree. So, I guess I would be curious to hear your advice. If you're thinking about 3 different women, a woman who's coming out of school and just going straight into the workplace, a woman who's taking her first job in management, and maybe a woman who's taking her first job in senior management, how you might think about advice to those 3 different people.
I think for the woman who's just coming out of school, potentially into a job, I would say that learning is really important. Be a sponge, learn as much as you can. I don't think it'll be different for men. And also realize that maybe your peer set has a much healthier ego than you do. So just, correct or overcorrect that you need to. And also watch out for the narratives that you have in your own head about proving yourself, about competition and stuff like that. I think for a person who's kind of been around for a little bit, I would say listen to the feedback that you're getting, but don't internalize it, right? Because it's a vicious cycle. The more somebody tells you that I would get feedback all the time, you talk too fast. And the more I would get the feedback about talking too fast, the faster I would talk.
I think I may have given that.
You might have to. But you were not the only one, Jack. So I got a lot of that. Or, that you show up in a certain way. So I think the more conscious you are about a certain characteristic, the more you don't want something to happen, the more you start exhibiting that kind of behavior. So I would say listen to the feedback, because acknowledge it, perception is reality, but also see how much of that you're buying and how much of that you can kind of let go. And a person who is in management, a couple of things that I would say. I would say the dynamics in the way men and women communicate is very different. The way the politics is played is very different. So don't be naive about it. Watch it. And then also, you don't have to become or play and conform to a role model that is not comfortable. Be comfortable in your skin, right? And say your piece that you have to. And do it with confidence. And people like it, that's great. If they don't, oh well.
What about a senior management first position?
I think senior management first position, I think there's a lot of responsibility that you have to nurture people, mentor them, I think coach them, take the time, because you haven't gotten where you have without help. And it's time to pay it forward. And there's a lot that you've learned along the way that I think you can pass on to other people so they don't make the same mistakes that you did.
Which is probably like one of the best expressions of power you can think of.
I think so.
I'd love to hear your perspective on the 15 years you've had in corporate America. Who helped you to do it well? In life, I should use.
Thank you. So this is going to be a little bit of a pop-up answer, right? Because my role models are, it's helpful to have a healthy role model. Because I think that becomes a little bit like the North Star for you, and you know which direction you're going in. And I think one that comes to mind immediately is my spiritual teacher, my guru, Sri Ravi Shankar. I mean, he embodies power, but in a way that, is very, very inviting. He doesn't undermine anything. He's helping you be the most powerful, wonderful version of yourself. And to me, that is truly what I aspire to be. The other couple of ones are one from a movie. I think if you've seen Wonder Woman, she really talks to me. I love it that she has, a spunk, and she can be, on the field, and she's such a great warrior. And the next minute she's soft and compassionate and vulnerable. I think the balance of that is very interesting for me, and that again talks to me. Another one that talks to me is from, one of the goddesses from the Vedic tradition, Goddess Durga, right? She's depicted as riding a lion. It doesn't get more powerful, the imagery doesn't get more powerful than that. She's on a battlefield, she's slaying demons, and yet on the other side, they talk about how she's one of the most nurturing energies, right? She's blessing, and she's giving you stuff and taking care. If somebody's hungry, like feeding them. I think this juxtaposition of having so much strength that you can be on a battlefield and not rattle, and have so much courage and warrior, along with softness, right? Because normally people who have a lot of strength tend to have an overdose of aggression, and people who are very soft tend to be a little bit on the weaker side. But this combination, which kind of, you have both of them at equal space and the right amount, is very, very interesting to me. And those are the examples that really talk to me. In life, I'm wondering, among the celebrities, I think Oprah is the one in my mind that comes closest to kind of owning her power. For a person who grew up in not so privileged background, African American, and then she made her life out to be exactly what she wanted it to be, and yet exuding that softness, not losing touch of that. I think it's been interesting to watch from the outside. Now I don't really know her. This is just my perception from the outside.
Well, if Oprah's watching, I'm sure she'll appreciate it. I guess another question I would ask you is, if you think about the techniques that helped you get to the point that you're at, right? You've talked to me a lot about the things that you had to go through, and the ways that you learned a lot of the lessons. It would be great if I think the viewers to hear some of those lessons.
An epitome of power for me is Guru Sri Ravi Shankar, right? He kind of epitomizes anything and everything. That's an enlightened being on the planet, so that's a tough act to follow sometimes. So I think as we think about power and all of these mindset changes, it's one thing to be aware of them. What are your patterns, what are your narratives, what is working for you, what's not working for you. But that alone just doesn't work. Because I've known my patterns for a very long time. But until I stumbled upon meditation, things did start pivoting. And the reason why I think about that very often is, when you're unwell, which I was a week back, and I was literally lying on this couch and, blanket on. And when you have a little bit of a viral, what the doctor says is get some rest. Because the body heals best when it's resting. Similarly, the mind or the emotions have to heal or change or groove in them. They need rest, and there is no bigger rest than meditation. So literally, I would highly recommend, and I would say it's a non-negotiable. If you want certain patterns in your life to change, awareness has to be complemented by meditation. And that is what the power punch is, I think. So for the International Women's Conference and this specific topic of owning your power, what would you think success looks like if this event comes off as well as we hope that it does? So I've been to a lot of these women's conferences. I believe this is the 9th one that we're doing. And it's amazing to watch because there are over 1,000 women who show up from different countries, or 50 to 100 countries that show up, and just learning from each other. And there's such inspiring stories, people that you and me may or may not have read about, but the things that people have been through and come out of it on the other side, you can go through a really tough experience in life bitter, or you can come out on the other side seeing how you can serve other people so they never go through it. And that has been amazing to watch. And for me, that exemplifies power. Women who've been through so much, and yet instead of bitterness, all they can think about is, how can I make the world a better place? There isn't like, why me? It's like, okay, how do I ensure that nobody else goes through it? So I would definitely say, if power is one of the things, if you want to learn from other women, be inspired by them, then February 14th to 16th, which is Valentine's Day, spend it with other women from all over the world, and you will be surprised at what might come out of the 2 days. Jackson, you can join us too. Men are invited.
That's a really inspiring, very, very inspiring invitation. I'll make sure that I can do something for that.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ruchika.
Thank you so much.